This will be the third kids movie I've reviewed on the channel, unless you count Caligula, which you should not. I was thinking I might give a big spiel about how kids movies can be pretty interesting to sit down and think about, also to watch. But instead, I'm just going to get straight into it. So this is Madagascar, Escape to Africa, which came out in 2008. I remember when Madagascar was in theaters. I don't remember the sequel coming out. This review will be mainly about the second movie, but I'll touch on all three Madagascar movies and on the Penguins of Madagascar, the movie, and on the Penguins of Madagascar, the television program, and on the Madagascar Penguins in A Christmas Caper short film that I remember seeing before some other movie I saw in theaters. Sort of in the days when the Pixar short film were all the rage. This was DreamWorks' attempt at it, I guess. Anyway, there's a lot of these things, big franchise, and that isn't all of it. Who would have thought that an African island could make so much money for DreamWorks Animation? And of course, Universal Pictures, who owns DreamWorks, and of course, NBC Universal, who owns Universal Pictures, and don't forget Comcast, who owns NBC Universal. First things first, let's go back in time to 2005, when the first movie is a hit. You find a child, and you ask them what Madagascar is. Do you think they'll say that it's a country or that it's a movie? The entire franchise has kind of an odd relationship with geography. On one hand, these are travel films that are structured by this relationship between New York and Africa, the city and the wild. So geography seems kind of essential, very important, right? But on the other hand, geography really takes a back seat at times. For instance, the title of this film, Madagascar Escape to Africa, this is a movie that shows Alex et al. Leaving Madagascar via Penguin Air, and after a fairly amusing flight sequence, crash landing in Africa. So they're escaping Madagascar to go to Africa. But Madagascar, some of the more astute geographers might note, is in Africa. Where exactly in Africa do they crash land? Well, it's in Africa. What more could you want to know? In Madagascar, this continent is all the same, really, and it's mainly filled with animals that sound like African Americans. Before we go any further, I want to mention two non-goals of the video. First of all, I get that this is a kids' movie, and it's going to have some simplifications and some inaccuracies. No worries. I'm not here just to point out all of the flaws. I'm hoping that we can look behind some of these things and find something kind of interesting. I'm also not really interested in the political ramifications of this stuff. If it sounds like I'm complaining about the movie not being progressive enough or with it enough, well, I don't really care. And again, I'm just curious about what might be below the surface. So anyway, back to geography. This movie opens up on the savannah, not Savannah, Georgia, but Savannah, the field, with a young lion named Alake being raised by his dad, Zuba, who's voiced by Bernie Mac, and his mom, who does not have a name in the film, but is voiced by Sherry Shepherd. Alake is supposed to be learning to fight, but he just wants to dance. Is there sort of a homosexual subplot in this film? Maybe. I'll skip the details, but Alake ends up in a crate which falls into the ocean and which drifts to New York. That's how I got to New York, by the way. He's found in the city, christened Alex. I guess it was just good luck that the zookeepers picked a name for him that was so close to the name that his parents had given him. In the first film, by the way, Alex at one point tries to call the police, and we get a view from the cop's perspective where we hear only roars through the telephone. So in this universe, animals cannot talk to humans, much like in our own universe, actually. It's not clear if animals can talk to each other in this universe that we live in here, but in Madagascar, the franchise universe, that's A-okay. Did you know, by the way, that Madagascar was actually only the fourth animated franchise, apparently? And did you know that Madagascar, the country, is the fourth largest island in the world? Interesting. Anyway, it's not the first time we've seen an animal float from one continent to another. In the original film, the animals are on a cargo ship bound for Kenya when they fall off and end up on the beaches of Madagascar. No, Madagascar isn't on the way to Kenya unless you know a shortcut. By the third movie, this kind of thing, this drifting around in the ocean, the ocean has a shortcut, has become a running joke with the animals leaving the savannah, which is apparently on the coast, and showing up in Monte Carlo wearing snorkels. In The Penguins of Madagascar, the prologue ends with the young penguins drifting out to sea on an iceberg, bound for adventure. So obviously this becomes partly tongue-in-cheek, and a lot of things in this movie and in this franchise are tongue-in-cheek, which is fine. I think the most immediate comparison with all this geography stuff is to Indiana Jones. That's what I was thinking of, at least, where a magical map animation can take us just about anywhere in a matter of seconds, is where it's no big deal for Indy to hang onto the back of a submarine and travel a few hundred miles underwater. That's another series where geography takes center stage and a back seat at the same time. So let's not make a mountain out of a molehill here. I think it's common for a lot of movies to be somewhat geographically vague. After all, we don't want to watch every step a character is going to take from one location to another. But I guess one thing you might say about this sort of vague geography in the film is that it's a way to commoditize the world, to commoditize traveling. When you think about it, Madagascar is basically a movie about tourists. No matter where the franchise takes us, everything is still grounded in this Western American hegemony. The movie makes fun of the animals being out of place, sure. They make fun of them being New Yorkers, but mainly the movies are stories of travelers successfully imbibing, enjoying, consuming local culture, successfully doing it, participating in a meaningful cultural exchange, right? Having fun traveling. The animals are accepted in Madagascar. They are welcomed in Africa, sliding right into the herd. The main challenges are personal ones, questions of whether the animals can cope with the environment, whether the animals are happy. We don't really have questions about whether the locals should welcome them. It's really, can they overcome being in the wild? And of course they can, because they're New Yorkers. Now, things are a little bit different with the circus in the third film. There is some friction, but it's smoothed over pretty quickly. So this movie shows us how great tourism can be, which isn't necessarily bad, but it skips out on some of the trickier questions. There's no geopolitical or economic conflict. There's no tension between insiders and outsiders. In the first movie, Madagascar is seemingly uninhabited. In real life, almost 30 million people live there. That's the degree to which this movie sidesteps any potentially complicated geopolitics and gives us Africa as we expect to see it from the U.S. In the second film, the only humans we see in Africa are tourists from New York and poachers. Now, no need to be outraged, but this is pretty interesting. One thing that I actually like about the first two films is that they are really driven by personal conflicts. Marty feeling like he has to get out of the zoo, Alex facing his demons, people trying to be friends with each other. The second film brings us even more into the realm of psychological drama, I guess. Among the conflicts is the story of Marty losing his sense of individuality, right? In some ways, that all sounds like the kind of movie I would be really interested in. The mature psychological realism or something like that. The third movie and the Penguins movie are completely different, by the way. They're built around grandiose plots of villainy. I don't really know enough about animation to say this for sure, but I think the animated films of the early 2000s may have been more focused on internal and interpersonal conflict, whereas newer films, perhaps mirroring the rise of the superhero movie, are more about avoiding the end of the world. I guess Chicken Little would be a counterexample. I'm not sure this theory really holds up, but I get the sense, at least, that the Penguin film was really influenced by Despicable Me, and possibly Despicable Me 2. It's got a goofy and relatable villain named Dave, an octopus, and it's really preoccupied with this idea of cuteness. It shows penguins as viral sensations powered by cuteness, really sounding a bit like the Minions here, and like it's somehow engaging with the Minions as phenomena. That movie had come out a couple years earlier. Like I said, Despicable Me 2 would already have been out by the time that the Penguins of Madagascar film came out. The Penguins film, by the way, came out after Madagascar 3. There's also in this Penguins movie an elite tactical squadron called the North Wind, which again seems like it would maybe resonate with some of the Marvel stuff. Before all this craziness, the first two films gave us stories about people, by which I mean animals, trying to lead meaningful lives. In a way, I think the cartoonish nature of the films makes it easier to bring these things into focus. Giving children stories about animals is a way to ease them into some adult emotions. There's a moment in the first film when Marty is talking about how he feels bored with his life. He jokes that he should go to law school. To a kid, this joke isn't going to make much sense. Of course, children's movies are rarely just made for kids. They're usually also made for parents. I'll talk about some of the other nice references we get earlier on, some of the other jokes for the parent, but I want to focus a little bit more on this one first. You know, a zebra being a lawyer is part of a very common category in kids' films where something that is not an adult human behaves like an adult human. So there's a zebra going to law school, for instance. In the second film, Melman becomes a doctor. A witch doctor, sure, but he says his mom would be proud. There's a great line in the third film where the penguins ask Alex to drive their car, and he says, animals can't drive, only penguins and people can drive. Of course, the airplane in this movie, in the second film, is full of playful imitation. The lemurs go so far as to set up their own miniature TSA, their own airport security. Mort can't get on the plane because he's carrying scissors and hand cream. So we don't need to dissect this stuff too much. It's some nice anti-logic, a bit absurd. I think when I reviewed the kids' film Robots, I pointed out some very similar jokes where, hey, it turns out this adult thing, this thing in the real world, is a robot. That's basically 90% of the jokes in that movie are about that. Very common type of joke, I think. And I think there is something a little bit deeper here about children's fascinations with the adult world and also adults' fascinations with a children's world. In some ways, a lot of these jokes are a bit like playing house, I guess. I was also reminded some of Creature Comforts while I was watching this movie. That's a show, television program, which was one of the first big hits from Aardman Animation. The show started from interviews conducted on the streets of England, and then animators took the audio and animated interviews to it, interviews given by animals, some kind of animal taking the place of each person. The interviews mainly touch on fairly mundane stuff, vacation stories about going to the beach, things like that. Mundane stuff, but the idea of animals inheriting this kind of life, I think it's pretty compelling to people. You know, they think they're people. The big category in children's films, but also Creature Comforts isn't explicitly for kids, really. And there's something that resonates a little bit more deeply about that, too, sort of the absurdism, quotidian absurdism, the things of everyday life, seeing them be repurposed or reimagined or something like that. Anyway, I want to mention some of the adult references in the film. Not that kind of adult reference, sadly. Since the adults watching these sorts of movies tend to be parents, you usually get popular culture references that are really dated, which is perfect for me. During the flying sequence in the second film, there's a little moment where Alex looks out the window and he sees Mort on the wing of the plane. He says, "Is that a gremlin?" Now, this is almost too on the nose, honestly, but there's a somewhat more subtle Twilight Zone reference in the first film that I really like. It takes place in the same airplane, actually, but this is before it's been repaired, and the plane serving only as a meeting place, only as an auditorium, basically, for the lemurs. King Julian and co. are discussing their visitors, the New York Giants, they call them. Maurice suggests that they might eat them, that the visitors might eat the lemurs. And all the lemurs freak out. They're panicking. They're all crying out. One of the lemurs holds up a book, which is titled "To Serve Lemur," which barely makes sense, to be honest, but fits pretty well with the jokes in the franchise. There's another interesting joke when the animals have landed in Africa and are meeting up with the other animals on the reserve. Marty says, "Hey, it's like roots." This takes us back to one of the most interesting things about Madagascar, which is how race is used. From the beginning, each of the animals has a pretty clear racial identity. Marty and Gloria are black animals, voiced by Chris Rock and Jada Pinkett Smith. Black meaning African American, not African. Alex seems to be a white animal, I guess. White American, Midwestern, probably. Melman is Jewish. The monkeys are British. Of course, these animals would actually all be from Africa, most likely. So where does this melting pot of American stereotypes come into it? In some ways, I guess it's not so different from every other kids' movies that tries to pull in as many viewers as it can, but that also tends to pull in some superficial black culture to seem cool and edgy. When I reviewed Inspector Gadget on this channel a while ago now, I pointed out that the Gadget-mobile, the car in that film, is black. Not literally black, but very clearly an African-American car. This is a talking car, by the way, and it's mainly the way that the car talks that would tip you onto this. Why is the car black? I mean, why? Well, I guess because it seems hip, seems edgy, or something like that. Interestingly, a lot of these characters might not be so far removed from something that would intimidate white parents in other contexts. There's an episode of The Simpsons where some network executives are giving Krusty, the clown, some notes. They tell him to be dangerous but warm and edgy cute. Sounds absurd, but it's not so far from the reality. I do think things have changed a bit over time, especially with the racial aspect. The third movie takes place in Europe, by the way. We mainly meet European animals like an Italian sea lion and a Siberian tiger, voiced by Martin Short and Bryan Cranston, respectively. That movie came out in 2012, and maybe by then people were already a little bit wary of some of the dynamics that are emerging in this film. It's interesting that the monkeys in the movie, who are the most intelligent of the animals, they're shown to be British. One of the monkeys is blind, by the way, and they speak together with sign language. The blind... No, not blind, deaf, because the blind monkey is the one animal that can read. The penguins are also kind of white characters in the movie to some degree. King Julian throws a lemur wrench into the whole thing. It's not exactly clear what Sacha Baron Cohen is doing, but interestingly, the song Move It has some Caribbean roots, and King Julian tends to imitate this when he's singing. Interesting. So, like I said, from the beginning, very clear racial identity, and a bit weird. Let me just leave it at that. When we show up to Africa, things get more complicated. As I've mentioned, the black animals that we have in the movie are portrayed as African American, really. When we get to Africa, you might wonder then, who are we going to meet? If we're going to meet their parents and their ancestors, are we going to be meeting more African American animals in Africa, or will these be African animals? And what about the white animals? What about Melman? Is he going to have a bunch of Jewish compatriots living in the savannah in Africa? It turns out, yes. It turns out that Alex's real name is Alake, and his parents, both of the voice actors for them, I think both Americans, but black Americans. That's interesting. Yeah, maybe more subdued in their identity, his parents, than Gloria or Marty. In Africa, for the most part, we find more African American culture. Obviously, the lines are not totally clear cut, and the movie is probably just characterized by confusion more than anything else. Um, I think there are moralistic points to be made about how the film takes from a lot of different cultures, how it's consumptive, I guess, and reductive, but I'm not really here to make that point, to be honest. And I'm not sure that I have any one firm conclusion on this front, really, except that, like I said, these movies can get pretty mixed up. There's an interesting moment later on in this movie where the troop of tourists, who are apparently all from New York, start living off the land. They're referred to by the animals as savages. To me, it kind of seems like this is all based on Native Americans, Americans, which is another just kind of odd moment. Speaking of the tourists, it's the granny from the first film who leads them, the grandmother that beats up Alex, and she does it again in this movie, it turns out. What was originally just a short gag about an extremely tough New York granny becomes a pretty major plot line, where her Terminator-like strength, I think, gets to feel a little bit one-dimensional, to be honest. I guess people must have thought she was a really strong character in the first movie, but here I think it's a little one-dimensional. This character's known only as Nana. Interestingly, this granny is coded as Jewish, you would have to say. Maybe this is just what they think it means to be a grandmother in New York. I'm not sure. In the third film, we have another Terminator woman, this time a French animal control officer. This character is a farce and basically zero-dimensional. One of the weaker points of the third film, I think. Obviously, it's intended as humor, but it just does not serve as very well as a dramatic linchpin of the movie. It's interesting that both of these movies have these sort of dark, ominous, Terminator-like women in them. Another odd thing to mention is the interspecies relationships that crop up in this movie. In the second film, we get more about the relationship between Melman and Gloria. To me, this seems like a fairly lame attempt to cash in on David Schwimmer's television career. No mention of whether or not anyone's on a break in this movie. Apparently, this plot line, the romance between the hippo and the giraffe, was originally going to be part of the first movie. One thing I wanted to mention about the giraffe that's pretty funny is if you watch the movie closely, you'll notice the giraffe has pretty much always bends his neck. Melman's got quite a kink in the neck, and almost certainly this is because they were having a hard time framing the movie. It's very hard to get all the characters in the same shot together when one of them has a head that's way up in the sky. So instead, if you watch, you'll see that in basically every single frame, he's doing some sort of strange contortion so that he might be near the heads and the eyes of the other characters. Anyway, like I said, this romance was originally going to be in the first movie, and there are hints of it there, but it's much more extreme here. And apparently the production felt at the time, when making the first one, that it wouldn't fit into a kid's movie. This story of interspecies love, why that's not appropriate for children is not exactly clear. I don't know. Maybe there's some roots of interracial marriages and the controversy they might cause, but I can't imagine a child would be particularly scarred by this sort of thing. I'm not sure. By the time the second movie rolled around, I guess they were emboldened enough by the success of the first one that they just said, let's put it in here. It's Madagascar. We like to go off the rails. The relationships are a bit tongue-in-cheek, these interspecies things. Besides Melman and Gloria, we also see Skipper's relationship with a doll. And in the third film, King Julian falls in love with a large bear that likes to ride a very small bicycle, possibly tricycle, I don't recall. Again, this would mainly just seem like something goofy, and maybe it is mainly that. But there's some interesting details to it as well, which is that it, I guess, puts some backspin on the usual children's progressivism. In other words, kids' movies are almost always going to contrive a romantic plot line that is going to transcend whatever barriers are in the way, right? People are going to fall in love. They should. That's what the point of a movie, right? Now, whether or not this is actually good advice for kids is a separate question. Here, the point is that this sort of sensibility is undercut a little bit by the fact that these romances are ridiculous, impossible, and unnatural. Do kids care? Probably not. Don't really know. And maybe this actually helps open up the movie and make it feel a little bit less like some sort of contrived romance. I think it works fine, I guess. But there's another example in the film of something kind of similar that I think is more of an issue. Specifically, Alex, I guess, kind of turns on his heritage as a fighting lion and instead becomes a dancing lion. This is quite the source of tension. But the film contrives things in a way that dancing wins out. Now, I will say that the way they do this is extremely lame, doesn't really make any sense. It's not too surprising, I guess, that a kid's movie, or even some movies for adults, are going to say, you should follow your heart, you should dance, don't listen to what those other people say, don't let tradition hold you back. But the thing is that these are animals, and lions probably do need to fight. A dancing lion would be a liability. And even if we indulge this film on that front, forget what we saw on Planet Earth about the cruelness of nature and such, forget all that. Well, the tradition that they're supposed to be eschewing here, the tradition that they're modernizing with the addition of dance or whatever, is the African heritage of the film. Alex wants to embrace his father's life, his upbringing, or whatever, except not the fighting part. He wants to revise his father's life. He wants to revise his heritage to make it fit with the things that he's already used to. Now, if it sounds like the movie is actually striking at something deep here, well, it isn't. It's more that this plot line just doesn't really make sense and is confusing. Now, again, I don't know if kids would care about this kind of thing, but I think that this is a little bit more serious than some of the romances in the plot in terms of just convoluting some of the didactic catalyst of the film, I guess. It's pretty noticeable when you watch it that the dancing didactics are a bit fishy, don't really seem to make that much sense. And like I said, on top of that, the sort of dancing plotline doesn't really make much sense either. As I briefly alluded in the beginning, you also could wonder if this is sort of as well as some sort of thinly veiled story about homosexuality as well. Certainly not too overt, but there are moments where it kind of feels like these are the kinds of, it kind of feels at times like Alex is about to come out or something like that, which is interesting. So, this movie ultimately puts its paw, I guess, I think in a lot of different places. And, it's kind of just this brash, goofy kids film that you wouldn't expect to do anything more than joke about various subjects or whatever. But on the other hand, I think there are some things that are a little bit deeper going on here. I think it's interesting the degree to which this is a tourist film and a travel film. I think that that's not something that would immediately jump out at you about the Madagascar series, but that is a pretty profitable way to think about the movies and how with tourism, consumptive tourism, comes all kinds of ideas about hegemony, exploitation, things like that. And those are a part of the movie. Not that it's anything particularly sinister necessarily, but it's a part of the film without a doubt. And similarly, I do think it is telling just how convoluted some of the racial and cultural narratives in the film are, just how clueless, just how much the film, despite taking place in Africa, is really structured by very simple American mainstream ideas, and how clueless it is about anything else, despite using so many of these cultural and racial ideas as a currency, despite harnessing so many of these things as characters that people will latch onto, as things that seem edgy, things that seem funny. There's still just a complete sort of incoherence to all of it. And I think that, like I said, is telling and reflects more deeply the way that the system tends to think about race sort of institutionally, or whatever, as in it consumes it. Which, yeah, again, I don't know if it's necessarily too sinister, but it's telling, I suppose. So that's some of the basics about Madagascar Escape to Africa and some of the other movies as well. To be honest, I do have a little bit of a soft spot for the Madagascar films. Escape to Africa really is not that great, but it's better than the next one, at least, which is really not that great. But even as these movies become chaos, confusion, and incoherence, all of them have a couple of funny jokes in them from time to time. And I guess I have some appreciation for that. So in some ways, a puzzling franchise, but not so uncommon for children's movies to be exactly that.